artist, a liar, a man who obstructs justice and incites insurrection? Will he ever be indicted or go to jail for anything, for any of it? We don't know yet. But we do know the one person who investigators believe is key to a case against Trump or his company, Trump's money man and longtime chief financial officer, Alan Weisselberg.
Alan Weisselberg. He's the chief financial officer of the Trump Organization.
Alan Weisselberg.
Alan Weisselberg.
Alan Weisselberg was everything to that organization.
Always Alan Weisselberg on the check.
I think that all roads lead to Alan Weisselberg.
The gatekeeper for every penny that came in and went out.
There you have it. The New York DA convening a special grand jury to probe the Trump Organization, which has already heard from Weisselberg's top deputy and has these cameras seeking out the typically reclusive Trump CFO. He knows whether the company committed fraud. He knows whether he committed any crimes of his own. There are reports that darkly suggest, yes, he did. Clues about an effort to flip Weisselberg so that he might save himself and implicate Trump. Now, grand jury probes are notoriously serious and completely secret. So it's not like reporting on or tracking some kind of normal jury trial. You can get clues from the people who go into the grand jury. In fact, they're the only ones other than the jurors and the lawyers who are in there. And you can get clues from other first-hand witnesses. We learned a lot that way reporting, for example, on the Mueller grand jury. And here on The Beat, we've been learning from people cooperating with this new DA grand jury probe and other witnesses. Which brings us to tonight's special report right now on Weisselberg as the man who may tip Trump's legal fate, and thus his business life and political career more than any other person we know of. What are we learning? Number one, this is no typical employee or worker. The ex-president's favorite rapper famously said, "I love you like Kanye loves Kanye," and from one MAGA narcissist to another MAGA narcissist, witnesses say Weisselberg idolizes Trump. So yes, he loves him like Trump loves Trump.
Alan Weisselberg is defined by what Donald thinks about him.
Weisselberg is one of those total sycophants.
Alan would not take an hour or day off if Donald was in the office.
That doesn't breathe or inhale or exhale without Trump's permission or knowledge.
His office is right next door. He discusses everything with him.
Weisselberg works directly with all the family. There he is, right behind Donald and the kids, who credit him publicly as fiercely loyal. And from growing up in Brooklyn to studying accounting and driving a cab, Weisselberg's big break first came in 1973 with the Trump family, when Donald Trump's father, Fred, a real estate developer, hired him after he applied for a job just listed in a newspaper ad. Donald Trump would put the former cab driver in charge of the big money decisions in the family business, following a pattern where Trump has promoted people far beyond the kind of job they might otherwise get in the open, fair market, which makes them extra eager to keep that post, even push boundaries. Trump himself wrote about Weisselberg in his book, Think Like a Billionaire, dubbing him one of the toughest people in the business when it comes to money. And here's the key part. He did whatever was necessary to protect the bottom line, Trump said. And he was sent to handle all kinds of priorities, from Atlantic City to Miss Universe, to a role that the camera-shy CFO might not have ever wanted, a supporting character on The Apprentice. That was a simpler time for both of those men, a fictional TV show completing a path from faking it till allegedly making it to faking it again, because if you think about it, that's what they were doing. Weisselberg was now faking and play acting in business, even seeming to help Trump brainstorm some of his lines. As Alan said, so that was point one. Alan Weisselberg likes it when that happens. He likes when Trump quotes him. He needs that job, and boy, has he tried to earn it. But earn it on Trump's terms. Point number two is about the work. Weisselberg is the eyes and ears of Trump org. He knows everything. He's literally the, quote, only non-family member tasked to help Don Jr. and Eric run the company during Trump's one-term presidency.
Alan Weisselberg managed the trust, and the two boys, Don Jr. and Eric, were the ones that were allegedly managing the company, but Allen was the gatekeeper. Now, mind you, each and every day they would send information back to Donald in the White House, who, of course, was signing still checks on behalf of the Trump organization.
Those checks range from the mundane to the salacious, including money for a now convicted crime, the hush money in the 2016 campaign, which included sham invoices, which Cohen and Trump agreed would be set up by Allen. The Allen in question, Allen Weisselberg, the name on the now infamous recorded 2016 call.
And I've spoken to Allen Weisselberg about how to set the whole thing up. So I'm all over that. And I spoke to Allen about it when it comes time for the financing, which will be...
So the three of them in on that. How did Weisselberg get out of his role in that jam? Well, this brings us to another point. Weisselberg can be legally pressed or flipped. It's just that it's never happened against Donald Trump. But when the feds wanted all the goods on that deal, the stuff from that call I just played you, Weisselberg was willing to cooperate as long as he got immunity for himself. And he provided information against Cohen, who went to prison. In a deal like that, legally, you are supposed to tell prosecutors everything. I mean, every last thing. But did Weissman find a way to focus on the things that seem to implicate Cohen more than Trump? Well, we don't have the raw interview transcripts. We just have the fact that is known. 3 men arranged a now convicted crime for the benefit of one of them, Donald Trump. And one of those 3 men did time for it, Michael Cohen. And one of them wiggled away, Allen Weisselberg. So let's be clear. This former Brooklyn cabbie may not ever be a top candidate for a CFO spot at one of the big Wall Street banks. But he does seem to know the streets and where he wants to go, because in other legal scraps, like a probe of the Trump Foundation charity, he also found ways to duck or divert, insisting in testimony there's no policy, he claimed, about basically anything the charity was violating, and then pressed about being listed as a board member there in that case for over a decade. He claimed he didn't know that he was. Now, it still led to another Trump legal loss. They quit, ending the whole charity, facing a fine. There was another legal loss that drove Trump U out of business. Weisselberg, who again is touted as the eyes and the ears of that parent company, was suddenly telling investigators that he just didn't, quote, micromanage when legal matters were involved. And that's despite evidence that emerged that he did choose to eavesdrop on Trump lawyers debating the wisdom of pretending that the for-profit, non-accredited operation should falsely claim to be a university at all. Now, that's another case where Trump lost and paid, literally. But as for tonight's special report, it's another case where Weisselberg just drove away from the scene of the problem, largely legally unscathed. Is this time any different? Well, many who worked with Weisselberg say probably. Some say outright yes. His former daughter-in-law spoke to investigators, so she's telling them stuff. And she's saying in public Weisselberg was in on changing the numbers to push Trump's financial crimes. He's also facing pressure for spending on real estate and schooling for his own family. Those reports could mean legal exposure for crimes allegedly committed to benefit himself, not the Trump organization. All these witnesses saying the heat is huge, with Jennifer Weisselberg, among others, saying he will fold.
There are a lot of differences when Donald says numbers are certain things and then Allen says numbers are certain things. They're not adding up.
I don't think Weisselberg would let his children go to jail. He must be shaking in his boots.
All right, the reason I believe he'll flip, yes, is because since his behavior since 2017, what I've witnessed is that when he took over as trustee, he was not only nervous, but he started immediately hiding money in escrow confidentially.
Now, those clips may look like TV interviews, and they are, but they could be a lot more than that. I can't tell you what those people are telling the investigators and the grand jurors, but I can tell you they have tremendous legal heat and pressure to be honest rather than commit a new crime of lying to the grand jury. So if what they told me, what they told us on the beat in these witness interviews is the same thing they're telling the investigators, well, that's a big deal. They're key witnesses. They know him. Weisselberg declined to comment and has maneuvered out of other jams before, as I emphasize. So if investigators don't ultimately have enough evidence on him, he still may not feel pressure to cooperate. Or he may try to beat any case at trial. Other Trump loyalists have certainly tried that tack, but most were counting on the backstop of a federal pardon, like what Roger Stone got, but what Trump can no longer give. It's not like Weisselberg does not know that top Trump org people can go to jail for what they do for Trump. You're looking at overhead footage of Michael Cohen reporting in. It was Weisselberg who literally helped seal Cohen's fate. So he knows where the trouble can lead. And that was back when Donald Trump was using gangster talk, dubbing Cohen a, quote, rat. But remember, it was Weisselberg who got immunity and was talking to the feds. So think about what was really happening with everything we know now, then. Remember the tape.
And I've spoken to Alan Weisselberg about how to set the whole thing up. So I'm all over that. And I spoke to Alan about it.
Spoken to Alan about it. 3 Trump org officials arranged that crime for Trump. And he calls the one doing time a rat, while the one talking, Weisselberg, gets to watch from a safe distance. Certainly not called out in public. And this is actually a pretty famous gray area in criminal stories, from informants like Whitey Bulger to stories like the iconic film The Departed. Some people do pull off cooperating while continuing their crimes. It's also a theme the artist Pusha T explores in a song about a cooperating criminal, recounting how, covering his own tracks, he didn't care that we had a legacy he killed. I got to wear that. Break your heart when the man you call your brother be the same one that set in motion all them undercovers. Pusha T continues, quote, from great friends, now it's no affiliation, divided by the time he was facing. We do know Weisselberg pulled off exactly that kind of move, whether it's from songs about snitching or movies like The Departed. He pulled that off once in a Trump org case. He got away. Does he have another ploy like that left in him? Or facing enough pressure, would a man who did cooperate against a peer at Trump org find it in himself to use that same high-stakes move against the boss at Trump org? And what makes people flip? Well, we have a guest who's actually done some of the most high-profile, intense legal flipping in the federal courts. Former prosecutor Andrew Weissmann, when we're back in 60 seconds. Turning to an expert on flipping witnesses, Andrew Weissmann is a veteran of the Mueller probe. He won the conviction against Manafort. He ran the Enron task force. He ran the fraud section of DOJ. And not to embarrass you with further history, but you are known for your skill and alleged toughness. Take a look.
Today, the Enron task force's continuing investigation has led to the unsealing of 3 new criminal indictments.
Andrew Weissmann, who is the head of our Enron task force, he and his brilliant team are in Houston today, where their hard work continues.
He has chosen his Jack the Ripper-like leader, Andrew Weissmann.
Andrew, thanks for joining us for this conversation.
Nice to be here.
I appreciate it. Given your expertise, when you look at an individual like Mr. Weisselberg with the history laid out, do you see him as flippable or less likely to be flipped?
Well, I think in a situation like this where the former president does not have the ability to dangle pardons, I think it's hard to say anyone is not flippable. The way you do it is through hard work, which is if there is a criminal case to be made, you make the strongest possible criminal case. I do think that this is a situation where if there is a criminal matter with respect to Alan Weisselberg, it looks like the Manhattan DA's office and the New York Attorney General's office are certainly pouring a lot of resources into uncovering it. So it's hard to imagine that he's going to slip away, as he may have done in the past. So one thing I would note is,
what is it?
With respect to his alleged cooperation in the Southern District of New York and going into the grand jury and potentially providing evidence that was used with respect to Michael Cohen, I would say the jury's a little out on that. It's not totally clear whether Alan Weisselberg provided anything meaningful or whether he was asked about anything beyond Michael Cohen. So, I think he's in a very different trick box now where he really is going to be facing
can I push you on that?
Of going to jail or not. Yeah.
I'm very curious what you can teach us about that, because as I mentioned in our report, you have 3 individuals, according to the audio tape, involved in something and other evidence. For the benefit of Donald Trump, Cohen goes to jail. I take your nuance about exactly what it was, but Weisselberg, in cooperating at all, would have to presumably answer questions about what the other 2 men knew and did?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I'm just saying 2 things. One, it's not clear he was truthful when he testified.
Yeah, I agree.
He may have said something that's not at all helpful. He could have said, I don't recall, for instance, and, and that may be true or not true. And then it's not clear if he was asked about anything more than the specific that you identified, Ari, so that he could have been asked just about that and not about the broader case, which appears to be what the New York prosecutors, both the Attorney General and the Manhattan DA's officer, are looking at. And then the final point, I'd like to throw out one more name, which is Jeff McConney, because I don't think that's gotten enough attention, because last week the reports were that he went into the state grand jury and he is the controller of the Trump organization. So again, all speculation, but clearly you're looking for an insider. That's why there is so much focus on Alan Weisselberg, trying to get somebody who is on the inside who would know where every penny went. Well, that's the controller as well as the CFO. So if Jeff McConney is cooperating, that is really bad news potentially for Weisselberg and for the Trump organization and other individuals, up to and including maybe the former president. In other words, Manhattan may have found their insider, because it would be unusual to put somebody like McConney into the state grand jury where he would be given immunity for, as soon as he testifies automatically, if they didn't think that he had something useful to provide.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and he directly reported into Weisselberg. While you're here, I have the benefit of getting you on the big news day with Don McGahn, former White House counsel, testifying. You worked for Bob Mueller, and McGahn famously was part of the resistance internally to what he said was Donald Trump's potentially unlawful order to try to fire Mueller without cause. He's telling lawmakers, I'm reading here from Judiciary Committee information, that Trump asked him to do, quote, some crazy blank. He was worried that firing Mueller, your boss, was the point of no return. Resignations, things could spiral out of control into a, quote, second Saturday night massacre. Your response?
Well, from my quick read of his quite voluminous testimony, he appeared to now, under oath, confirm what is in the report, which is that he was asked by the former president of the United States to fire and to seek the firing of Bob Mueller from the Justice Department. That later, the president wanted him to go out and deny a press report that had happened. And Don McGahn testified under oath that he refused to do that. In part, he said he had already told the special counsel's office what had happened, and he wasn't about to, as he said, risk going to jail by denying what he had just told the special counsel, which was what the president asked him to do, and he wasn't about to say that wasn't true. So very dramatic testimony. It did largely repeat what's in the report, but you were hearing it directly from the witness and under oath.
And I'm almost out of time here, but was it good for Donald Trump that he had some lawyers around him who apparently, according to this testimony, just simply refused to carry out what they thought was an unlawful order, and then Trump on that score ultimately blinked and backed down.
Yeah, well, Don McGahn was not the only person, but yes, there were people around him who simply refused to do his dirty work. And in many ways, he was saved by people who basically either didn't want to go to jail, which Don McGahn today, in the testimony, said that was one of the things that motivated him, and was willing to resign over it. But you have other people, the former Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, who was refusing to do things as well. So I do think that the former president was helped out by people who appear to have a lot more of a conscience and duty to the public than the former president was showing.
Very interesting to get your insight, given your expertise on both those stories. Thank you, Andrew.
You're welcome.
Washington, but also around the world. President Biden taking his first foreign trip while his domestic agenda is hitting clearly a critical new phase. Biden in the UK for the G7 summit, leaving Washington just hours after dramatically and distinctly breaking off those direct talks with top Republicans on the jobs plan. Biden shifting his focus to the remaining possibility, this bipartisan group of moderate senators, which includes Joe Manchin, the Democrats' key vote on so many issues in the upper chamber. Now, while the White House says Biden can give Republicans a chance before moving past them, progressives are dialing up the pressure as well tonight. They say any more delays risk just giving Mitch McConnell too much sway right now. The influential Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez asking if playing patty cake with GOP senators is really worth the dismantling of people's voting rights, setting the planet on fire, allowing massive corporations and the wealthy to not pay their fair share of taxes, etc. She doesn't think it's worth it, as you can see from the question. Meanwhile, a new report from a top pollster says even some Democratic voters are now unsure of what the party stands for at this moment. Quote, voters are not hearing enough about what Democrats have accomplished and what they're fighting to accomplish. That puts it in perspective. And while everything in politics can be ideological or partisan, I show you that poll as a reminder that while Joe Biden is doing things, we've covered the impact of the stimulus and the checks already, even some Democrats are wondering, with all the obstruction, what are they getting in this first pivotal period of the Biden administration? Progressives have been clear. They know Mitch McConnell. The country knows Mitch McConnell. You watch the news, you know Mitch McConnell. Progressives warning
progressives about the gridlock in Washington and about the amount of time that the White House is spending talking to Republicans to try and get bipartisanship on something, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's police reform. And there is a feeling amongst progressives like AOC that it's time to pull the rug from those discussions. I spoke to Brendan Boyle, who's also a member of that Progressive Caucus, and the Progressive Caucus is about half of the members, the Democratic members of the House. So it's a very big caucus, and within that caucus there are different views. Brendan Boyle much more sympathetic to Joe Manchin's position and to the need for some form of bipartisanship. I guess the response from more moderate Democrats and from the White House to the more progressive wing is fine, but then what? What's the actual process once you stop those negotiations? If you call a halt to trying to get some form of bipartisanship, then how do you get legislation through the Senate? Because you're still left with the fact that there are only 50 Democratic senators, and one of them, or two of them, or perhaps even more of them, are resistant to some of the things that the more progressive members like them to do. So you have a kind of reality check, I think, at the end of that question that some of the more progressive people on the left of the Democratic Party are asking, let's pull the bipartisan negotiations and let's just move forward. And the question then is how?
Yeah, I mean, Caddy is very perceptively laying out, as you so often do, the difference between the emotion around the politics in Washington and the actual process, Che, where there is a kind of political transitive property. The Democrats need Joe Manchin. And Joe Manchin, whether you agree with him or not, seems to think he needs either Republicans or the appearance of really trying to get Republicans. So you're in this thing where what you really need is Manchin, at least on economic votes, right, where you can do it on 50. I think people understand that. But then he needs this wider public kabuki theater of saying, look how hard we tried. And I want to show a little bit of cameras caught up with some of these moderates today about all this. Take a look.
Well, I appreciate the frustration, but I think if we can get a bipartisan agreement, it would be very important for the country.
They've been able to do that from the beginning of this. I think eventually that's where they're going to end up.
Elections have consequences, and the Democrats have a very small majority, and as a result, they can take action on their own.
I never give up. Never give up.
A little window into what it's like there on the ground, Che. Speak to the transitive property and how much has to be done for Joe Manchin to say we tried.
Well, it's really put up or shut up time for Joe Manchin, I think, on this whole idea of getting a bipartisan compromise on infrastructure. You know, a cynical politician would say, or a cynical person would say, the reason we want to keep the filibuster is because we want to avoid these difficult votes. We want to avoid these difficult votes that will put us on the spot in these red or purple states. That's not what Joe Manchin and a lot of other moderates on the Democratic side, like Kristen Sinema, would say. They say the reason for the filibuster is to foster bipartisanship and cooperation. At this point, there is zero empirical evidence that any bipartisanship or cooperation has been fostered by the filibuster. None at all. In fact, the last time that Democrats and Republicans worked together in the Senate was when they were cowering in a bunker because a Trump mob was invading the Capitol. And then afterwards, Republicans refused to hold the mob or the mob leader accountable for anything. That was the best time for bipartisanship, you would think, and there was no bipartisanship. So really, at this point, it's time for Joe Manchin, for Kristen Sinema, and for others to show some results from bipartisanship, because they have shown us nothing in all these weeks and months.
Che Komanduri coming spitting hot fire at Joe Manchin. I think a lot of Democrats in your party agree with you, Che. To that point, Joe Manchin has been meeting with some of these critics, which suggests that he cares to be seen meeting with everyone. And we have a little mashup here of how he's putting it and how they've been putting it. Take a look.
What we had was we had a respectful, we had a very informative, and it was a very good conversation we had.
Joe Manchin has become the new Mitch McConnell.
Senator Manchin would rather preserve Jim Crow on some outdated theory of bipartisanship.
Did they describe any disappointment in you saying that you would vote against S1?
Very good, respectful group.
A tale of two meetings. S1 is one of these key voting rights bills. It's adjacent to this because, as you know, Che and Caddy, there have been many people making the argument that even if you don't eliminate the entire filibuster, in what we're living through right now in the nation, it's a matter of democratic legitimacy to make sure that the voting rights of the American public are protected amidst all this, including the mob you just mentioned, Che, and that can't be held to some minority veto, Che.
Yeah, and it's something to keep in mind as Joe Biden goes overseas. He's going overseas in capacity as the leader of one of the world's great democracies, meeting with other leaders of the world's great democracies. Quite frankly, during the Trump years, America wasn't seen as the leader of the world's great democracies. And the GOP is doing everything they can to keep that sort of Trump status quo in place where our democratic rights are ebbing away. Now, a lot of moderates say we have to work with Republicans. We have to show bipartisanship. That's a perfectly decent political strategy, provided you can show some results and pull that off. However, if you show no results and Democrats get nothing for all their pains, it will lead to the worst possible consequence, which is Democrats will be demoralized and they will stay home in 2022. We have to have something to run on in 2022. Mitch McConnell has done everything he can to make sure Democrats and Joe Biden have nothing to run on. That is their strategy, and so far they're executing it perfectly.
Caddy?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's clearly a lot of frustration amongst Democrats, progressive Democrats, particularly when it comes to H1 and H4, about which there is this sense of urgency that they need to move fast because of the legislation that's going on around the country. I'm just not sure that saying to Joe Manchin repeatedly, you've got to now give up on bipartisanship, is actually going to get him to give up on bipartisanship. And the discussion that's happening in the White House is what can we give Joe Manchin? Is it more negotiations? Is there something that will get him to vote yes to key parts of our legislation? Because telling him he has to do that and telling him to give up on bipartisanship doesn't seem to be working, right? I mean, that doesn't seem to be getting there, and it's not clear, and I think this is also some of the frustration, what Joe Manchin wants. It probably helps Joe Manchin when he is criticized by the progressive left of the Democratic Party because he has such a narrow majority when it comes to West Virginia, and West Virginia is such a conservative state. Maybe it helps him to be able to go back and say, look, you see, the left of my party doesn't like me. That should give you cover to vote for me, you more conservative Democrats in West Virginia. I think the frustration in the White House and the frustration in the progressive wing of the Democratic Party is in a sense the same. What does Joe Manchin need to get to yes on key parts of our legislation?
Yeah, no disrespect to his political position because he's in an overwhelmingly red state, but if what he needs is not actually publicly definable results, like here's what I brought home, that's, constituent politics, or here's how I moved the substance, but rather I need Mitch McConnell and his friends to come along. That was literally what he said on the voting bill, and it's like, well, then we're back to Charlie Brown. That's not going to happen, no matter how much time you give him, which I think is why some of this is a rerun, and yet the stakes couldn't be larger, because for viewers watching at home saying, okay, is this all internal Washington stuff? No, we're talking about just as the stimulus, or what Che likes to call the stimmy, as the kids call it online, the stimmy was a big deal. It affects whether you can make rent. It affects whether you can go out. It affects bridging the hardship that people are going through. And this next round of job funding to the tune of $1 trillion or $2 also is a real big deal. I'm going to fit in a break because we have that big special report.